So by popular demand, our guest on SDP Talks today is Senior Lecturer in Politics at Liverpool University and former Chairman of the Social Democratic Party, Dr. Kevin Hickson. Kevin, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Great. Now, most of these political podcasts with authors are here to discuss one book, but we're lucky today. We're going to discuss two. The first is your biography of Peter Shore, which you wrote with Jasper Miles and Harry Taylor. And secondly, a more recent book on Jim Callaghan. So first, Peter Shore. I mean, I have to say, I'll declare, I think you know, that Peter Shore is a major political hero of mine. And his book, Separate Ways, changed my life, I suppose, in politics, because previous to that, I was, certainly in the 80s, I was a sort of moderate supporter of the European project. And then you read more and you discover what the reality is, and of course the European project changes. And I read a review of Separate Ways written by Peter Riddle in the Times. I got the book, I read it, and he totally convinced me. I think it was a brilliant, absolutely brilliant book. And obviously now Peter Shore is known as a Eurosceptic and Labour patriot. So can you just give us a sketch of this important politician from sort of his early days and then his importance in the Labour Party?
Yeah, sure. Well, just to go back to what you're saying about Separate Ways, I very much agree with you about that. I came to the Eurosceptic cause a bit late as well. So up until really the start of 2016, I was still in two minds over whether to be... I was never an enthusiast, but maybe a reluctant Remainer, as it were, or to leave. And again, Peter's work, even though he died some years before, did influence that decision that I took in 2016. So he was initially, he'd been a distinguished academic career at school, at Cambridge University, where he became one of the elite group of the Apostles. And then after a service in the RAF, he went into becoming a political advisor to Harold Wilson and then an MP from 64. And I think all the people we interviewed for that book said the same thing, which was what struck me when the only occasion I met Peter was when I was doing my PhD. This was back in 2001, the same year that he died. How modest he was. And all the people who, that struck me and has stayed with me since I interviewed him at that time. And all the people we interviewed for that book said the same thing, that a modest, self-effacing character, which is, of course, unusual in politics.
It is unusual in politics, and actually, I was going to ask you probably later on, but I'll ask you now. Obviously, he co-authored, I think, 3 Labour Party manifestos, and was certainly very, very close to Wilson in influence terms in the 60s, and obviously became a cabinet minister. But he didn't get to the top, did he? He didn't actually, I mean, he tried for Labour leadership, didn't he? Twice, was it? Yeah. Yeah, and failed. It's interesting that he didn't get to the top, because obviously I admire him intellectually, and I think he's certainly in terms of being right about politics and prescriptions, he was there. But he had limitations as a party politician, didn't he? And what do you think they were?
Yes, I think that's right. I think he was, again, because of his modesty, although some people thought it came across as arrogance, he was rather aloof. Yeah. He was not the sort of politician who would frequent the tea room and try to build up a coterie of support. And so, he didn't have much time for that, and he didn't suffer fools gladly either, I don't think, really. So he didn't build up that support in the way that you need to do in order to get to the very top. And that showed in 1980, which was his big chance to become leader of the party. Michael Foot was going to endorse him. He went away on the Friday to go and to give a lecture about Jonathan Swift, and said, when I come back on Monday, I will declare my support for you, which would have brought Peter Shore the left of the party, and he would have won. But over that weekend, Michael Foot was persuaded by his wife, in particular, also some of the trade union leaders, to stand, and that scuppered Peter's chances, really. And again, that was, I think, one of the things to note there is that the other limitation with Peter, in terms of getting to the very top, was that he wasn't really a trade union man. He was a member of the trade union, but he didn't build up that support in the way that Michael Foot did, which proved crucial in 1980. Yes,
I wonder what would have happened had Foot not stood. I mean, how far do you think Shore would have got in that?
Well, we speculate about that in the book, and of course there's no way of knowing, but we did say that it was perfectly reasonable to conclude that he could have won. It would have been pretty much a straight contest between him and Dennis Healey. Healey was by far, opinion polls suggested at that time, a very popular politician, perhaps the most popular politician in Britain. But those who knew him knew that he had character traits which weren't particularly attractive. He was unnecessarily aggressive and rude and so on. So Peter may have persuaded the people in the centre of the party as well as on the left. And in those days, that was the last contest where it was just the MPs who decided. And so Peter may have won. And I think he would have performed better then than Michael Foot. I mean, Foot did distance himself from the hard left at the time, as you recall, and he did support the Falklands War. Mainly, Peter encouraged him in that direction. But the Falklands War would have not become the political issue it was, I don't think, in '83. And Peter may have also stopped the breakaway to the SDP to some extent.
Very possible.
And also stopped the rise of the hard left, because he was initially very friendly with Tony Benn. And they fell out. At that time, it was only towards the end of their lives where they made up.
Very interesting. I mean, certainly his character, it's unusual. I mean, he wasn't a front-line politician, a typical politician, was he? More thoughtful, as you say, probably more shy as well. I mean, it's interesting when you watch we'll talk about that wonderful speech a little later, but the speech, to have such arguably one of the best speeches ever given, by someone that is actually quite reserved, he was sort of probably on autopilot. It was very interesting. Can I just get, because he's so associated with Euroscepticism. Obviously this was very, very deep rooted, wasn't it? Went all the way back. And the patriotism, it linked to his patriotism. And he was one of the very few people that actually bothered to read the Treaty of Rome, and therefore he's one of the few parliamentarians that really knew what the implications were, because so few didn't. Can you tell us a little bit about
that's right. It was difficult at that time to get a copy of the Treaty of Rome in English. Peter got one of the copies and read it when we interviewed his widow. She described it as a tripping hazard in the bedroom in more ways than one.
That's right.
Because he would study it at night. It was it was a bedtime reading, really. Because he wanted to read the whole thing, and right from the start, he was, as you said, a Eurosceptic. When most people in Britain were either indifferent or regarded as a second-order issue, or were very much pro. The Conservative Party was overwhelmingly pro-European. Macmillan led the first attempt at membership, of course. And Peter was, as we said, one of the early Eurosceptics, and did persuade, to some extent, I think, Hugh Gateskill to write that speech. He didn't actually write the text for the speech, but he wrote the briefing papers that led to Hugh Gaitskill's
The 1,000 Years of History
speech. Because they realised that it was essentially committed to free market economics and free trade, that it did undermine the sovereignty of the nation state, and that it would impede a future Labour government from introducing the sorts of things which they wanted to introduce.
That's the very, very point, and it was a key point, actually, one of the key points in Separate Ways, which is that you can't really self-govern, you don't have the scope to make your own social and economic bargains if you're inside that club. And it's a point that I was lucky enough to review the book for The Spectator, and I drew that out, and it said, in saying that Shore made the point, the sort of killer point really to fellow members of the left, which is the EU contradicts the very Keynesianism which you profess to want to implement. And it's surprising how few people on the left really understood that. Why was that?
Yeah, well, initially, I think Peter's view was much more widely held in the party. So, of course, in '83, the party was committed to withdrawal without even another referendum. And the change in the Labour Party happened very quickly in '88, when Jacques Delors came over and spoke to the TUC and said, we're going to introduce this social policy aspect.
Seduce them, really.
And they thought that was all the things which they wanted, which they couldn't have in Britain because Thatcher was winning. And I think it only really resonated with people in the party and the trade union movement at that time, because after the '87 defeat, there was a mood of pessimism in the party that Thatcher had won 3 times. She was unstoppable, she couldn't be beaten. There was no way of reversing this tide of neoliberalism in Britain. And so they thought they could have some of it back through the back door, as it were, through Brussels. And again, Peter was very critical of that view because he thought that the social chapter didn't really amount to very much. They'd ignored the fact that it furthered the free trade, created the single market, the moves towards a single currency.
They went for the tactical, didn't they? They thought, well, if we can get this through those means, that's sufficient. Whereas it's actually a mistake, because what really matters is who is making the policy,
Absolutely.
not just what the policy is.
And that was very much Peter's point, that there was nothing in the social chapter which the Labour Party couldn't offer to the electorate at the next election, and then introduce it through a sovereign parliament.
And it prevents you doing many other things that you may wish to do, but are breached by the rules. No, it's very good. I think I think Shore's brilliant on that. And another aspect, obviously we've mentioned, is patriotism, the combination of state and nation, which you've mentioned to me before, which is this belief in the nation as a sovereign entity. It's us. But also a belief in the state, and belief in state capacity to make lives better and to intervene for the good.
Absolutely. So it's the belief in both the nation and the state. And historically, the left was stronger on the state but weak on the nation. The Conservatives may be stronger on the nation but weaker on the state. And for Peter, it was very much both. That a sovereign Westminster Parliament could introduce these sorts of things. So Peter wasn't ashamed to sit alongside right-wingers on platforms. He did that in the 75 referendum. He got involved in the Bruges group and so on later on. So he was prepared to share a platform because he believed that restoration of sovereignty was absolutely fundamental. But he wouldn't for a moment have agreed with what those right-wingers wanted to do with the sovereignty once they reclaimed it.
No, nor me, but there you go. No, I think he's brilliant on that. And another thing I think he gets very, very, his analysis is absolutely spot on, is his view that the nation's interests, the country's interests, don't always align with what big business wants. He's very, very good on that. And I think we've probably had 30 years of this idea that, what business wants it gets, and that the interests are aligned. No, they're not always, and you need a state to intervene on the nation's behalf to sort of save it from the worst aspects of business. Do you think that's a fair?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, for the last 30, 40 years, we've had this economic liberal view that all that matters is maximisation of profit, the short-term business interests of corporations. And that the larger corporations, in particular the global corporations, don't act within the national interest, really.
No, that's right. No, I think he's got that right. He also, finally, the review I did for The Spectator, I drew one more thing out, which is that he gave a sort of pre-warning on ID politics. Because for him, his type of socialism was a sort of unified sense of us. So you're trying to bring people together, and he said this many years ago in the 80s, that you'll not achieve that coalition and basically convene the unity to get Labour to win if you hammer these minority grievances. And again, I found Shore throughout prescient and his rightometer is very high, correctometer I should say, very, very high, and it's yet another thing that he's got right. Do you think that's fair on ID politics?
Yes, and Peter was very critical of the 83 manifesto for that reason. So as you said, he stood again.
That's when it started.
In 83.
Yeah.
And in Labour's Choices, the Fabian Society pamphlet that was put out with a statement from each of the four contenders for leadership, Peter was really the most far-reaching on that, maybe because by that stage he realised that he hadn't really got much hope of winning, so he didn't mind shocking people and saying uncomfortable things. But it was a very far-reaching agenda which he had in 83.
Just to finish on Peter Shore, I mean, I was, I'm an admirer, and I think there are 4 published books, and I had all those books. But I looked for a biography, and there wasn't one. And I just think it's wonderful that you and Jasper and Harry have got this together and finally, published a biography to a man who I think is not just important in Labour Party history, but British political history as well, and much underrated. So finally, the final question is, how do you think Peter Shore will be remembered?
Well, to go back to the point you were making there, I mean, that's why we chose the subtitle that we did for that book, which is Labour's Forgotten Patriot, because he was very much a forgotten figure. But also there was a double meaning in that, which is that the Labour Party had forgotten how to be patriotic. And we saw that over the post-2016 with the demands for a second referendum and so on. The Labour Party moved further and further away and ultimately paid the price. And it wasn't surprising that they paid the price that they did in December 2019, because they were essentially saying to the British people, we don't like you, we don't like your views, but please vote for us anyway. And of course, the people weren't willing to do that.
No, it's a major betrayal.
In huge numbers. And again, as the Labour Party seeks to recover from that, then it needs to reconnect, I think, with that forgotten patriotic tradition, which used to be very rich in the Labour Party. So Attlee, Gateskill, Ernie Bevan, and Peter Shaw and others as well. And across the party, so Ben was a very patriotic in his own way, and Michael Foot too.
Healy.
But the party's forgotten that patriotic tradition. And I think that's the significance of Peter Shaw today, that it needs to reconnect with that tradition.
I think you're absolutely right about that. I think that's true. I'm not at all optimistic in the Labour Party making that adaptation. I think for various reasons it probably can't now. But I think Shaw will be remembered mainly now, certainly among younger people, for the 75 speech of the Oxford Union, which I think I said to you that it was probably one of the best political speeches ever, and you said that it was one of the best speeches ever. So, and I think we have that speech, and we're very lucky to have it. Again, so prescient. Do you agree? Yeah,
absolutely, and that's revived Peter Shaw's reputation much more than the book, because it's very widely shared on the internet. And Peter, despite we talked about him being a shy and reserved character, but he was capable of those great speeches when he was impassioned. And the thing that impassioned him most, you remember that sitting opposite him was Ted Heath. And he really did dislike Ted Heath because he thought that the pro-European cause was dishonest, but particularly Ted Heath.
No, I think he had that right. I think history probably proves it. So let's get on to the second part of the interview, which is the new book that you've edited with Jasper Miles, James Callaghan, an underrated Prime Minister, and it's very interesting because Callaghan is associated, isn't he, with sort of 1970s corporatist failure, isn't he? And people have written and said that he's actually the personification of that. So you just think of British Leyland, you think of strikes and industrial unrest, you think of high inflation and stagflation, the winter of discontent, the IMF episode, and so on. So, first question: do you think it's fair to associate Callaghan with that as an individual?
Well, he'll always be associated with those times, of course, and he had a long career. The only person to hold the top 4 offices of state in the 20th century, and was always going to build up a lot of enemies. And so people felt that he'd failed in all of those posts, and they weren't surprised when he failed, in inverted commas, as Prime Minister. But I think you have to judge Prime Ministers not by the conditions in which they operate, really, and the level of complexity and the level of the challenges that they face. And Callaghan, probably the worst inheritance of any post-war Prime Minister.
I agree. I was in the sort of plan of the interview, I was going to talk about that right at the end, because I was going to try and we may as well do it now. But I think, yes, what he had to deal with immediately, because remember, it was a surprise that Wilson stepped aside, and then literally within months you're plunged into a financial crisis which involved the IMF, and right the way through, you had that, and then. Not a lot of progress on the foreign policy stuff with things like Rhodesia, intractable economic problems at home, and then finally the winter of discontent and the delayed. So the whole thing is like a series of major challenges. But compared to, say, Blair, who was given a golden economic legacy, as you know, I'm not a fan of Blair's inheritance at all. I think he, dreadful Prime Minister, but to compare what Callaghan had to deal with, and actually Callaghan held his party together during that period. And in terms of political management, would you agree that he was an extremely skillful?
The master, really, I'd say. So I asked some students, who are strong and weak prime ministers, and they normally say that Thatcher and Blair were strong prime ministers because they won elections, they got their legislation through comfortably because they got a large parliamentary majority and so on. But that doesn't take account of the context in which they governed. They had
no majority.
All sorts of opportunities. Callaghan lacked a majority. Divided party at all levels, very divided cabinet. That cabinet included Tony Benn and Dennis Healey and every opinion in between. So a very divided party, a minority government. a terrible economic inheritance, as you said, mounting trade union unrest. People forget about the fact that he held it all together.
He held it all. I don't think anyone else would have done so.
No one else could have done it, really.
No, I agree with you about that.
And he deserves credit for that. But also, after the IMF crisis, in 77, 78, the economy improved. That's, again, something which is forgotten. He was bringing down inflation, which was his aim. It went up again after Thatcher became Prime Minister in 79. He avoided the social distress, social misery of the 80s.
Yes.
As well. Unemployment did go up, but not by the scale it did under Thatcher.
That's true. No, in reading the book, obviously one of the nice things about the book is very diverse. So you've got a very diverse set of contributors that don't all agree it, which is actually very helpful.
Which is one of the aims that we try to do, as we said in the
viewpoint
the
diversity
to the book, viewpoint diversity, which I think is under threat in so many ways.
No, it is under threat,
these days.
And it's wonderful to read it. But I particularly enjoyed Roy Hattersley's comment on Callaghan as the master of the Pyrrhic defeat, which I thought was wonderfully put. So Pyrrhic defeat, which is having a position he always supported, forced upon him, which is very good.
So he's probably always going to go, in the end, along with Dennis Healy's position on the IMF.
Yes.
Although I think he was intellectually persuaded by the likes of Tony Clouston, who said there was no need for this package of cuts. And Dennis Healy conceded in his memoirs that they got it, the Treasury figures were wrong. Yes. And if they'd been correct, there wouldn't have been the pressure that there was.
But it does make you wonder, because it's almost, the IMF episode is almost the stuff that conspiracy theorists might get a hold of, because that was the pivot where corporatist Keynesian approach to running the economy pivoted late 76, and you had the famous speech at the Labour Party conference, which I think Peter Jay wrote and Callaghan delivered, and saying that, such as it was a policy, it didn't work. The previous Keynesian approach.
Which can I say, as a description of the post-war economic policy, is wrong, because that was the first time the economy grew, bit stop-start, but it grew generally. Full employment was maintained until that point. So when Keynesianism was really tested for the first time, it was abandoned.
Yes.
So Callaghan would have known that that was not an accurate description. And when I was, because I did my PhD thesis on the IMF crisis, and Callaghan wrote to me and said that I think there was him and Healy would have said the same thing, that they didn't really agree with monetarism, they weren't believing monetarism, but they felt that in order to regain international confidence, those are the things that needed to be said.
Yeah, obviously everyone has a slightly different reading of it, but my reading is that the prime problem was inflation, stagflation. So inflation was deemed to be getting out of control, and there was always this trade-off between inflation and growth, and that you see that. I've been reading the Harold Wilson, Lyndon Johnson correspondence recently, and it's very, very interesting. I'm about halfway through that book, but constantly, and this is when Callaghan was Chancellor, every time Wilson tried to go for an expansionary economic policy, reflate in other words, you sucked in imports and you put pressure on the pound because the balance of payments went wrong. So there are all these interlocking problems, and I think you can see whether they really need, the Treasury's figures were wrong, and they probably, in my view, didn't need to go to the IMF, but it certainly hurt the Labour Party's reputation, didn't it?
Yeah, I think that the other interesting thing about that period as well is that was the time when protectionist economics was first seriously talked about in Cabinet.
Yes.
And because it was then became associated with the alternative economic strategy and the 83 defeat, the Labour Party hasn't dared revisit any of those ideas. But if we look at today, I think there is a case for a limited protectionism. No, I totally agree with you, and we've joked privately, haven't we, that every time I talk about some trade friction, you accuse me of wanting to pull my leg and saying I want a sort of Bennite siege economy, which is not what I'm after. But there is a role for some trade friction, and I've argued strongly as I can that this idea, this sort of neoliberal idea of indifference to what is made where and by whom, we're at the end of that. And actually, one of the silver linings out of the pandemic is that I think the public is seeing the end of it as well. So actually, I don't want it personally. I wouldn't have an FTA with the United States. You wouldn't have very much of your agriculture left. You certainly, it would affect your financial services and other things. And actually, by the way, we've got a thumping great trade surplus with the US now. So why would you
So I buy into this. I think Callaghan obviously famously slapped 15% tariff on, didn't he, in the 60s without consulting others, and it caused. But it was a totally different time. But I read the IMF and the speech to the Labour Party conference in '76 as being the pivot from that type of economic policy to a much more stringent monetarist obsession with inflation, which you saw come right through the whole of the 80s.
Yeah.
So maybe that was the switch point. Do you think that's a fair?
That was a switch point, but again, to go back to the point I was saying before, I don't think Callaghan believed in monetarism or he.
No.
And so the 79
So it wasn't a Pyrrhic victory. It wasn't a Pyrrhic defeat.
With Thatcher and Howe.
Yeah.
I mean, they were.
Oh,
really
no,
believing in
they
monetarism.
totally.
Yeah.
No, they were freedmen. No,
Yeah.
they'd drunk the Kool-Aid on that stuff. Yeah. So let's move. So that's the IMF. So let's move towards the end of Callaghan's time as Prime Minister, which is characterised by Lib-Lab pact, because he didn't have a majority, this constant management of votes in the Commons. And then a choice, does he go late or autumn 78 to the public, to the country, or does he go later on? He went later on, and a lot of people say, well, that was a mistake and it's a counterfactual, so you'll never know and you can't possibly know. But here's my view. I don't think he thought he could win. I think I think the polling Bob Worcester was doing said maybe he'd get something like a 10-seat majority, something not decisive, and he thought, well, I may as well ride it out. And obviously he lost to Thatcher on 40 seats and something like that in the end. So obviously the fact that he lost, people think that was a mistake. What's your take on that whole question of?
Yes, I agree. I think Callaghan looked at the private opinion polling which had been given, and it suggested that he wouldn't win or win, but with a very small majority.
Yeah.
And I think by that stage he was fed up with trying to cobble together deals. It was all rather unseemly parliamentary practices in order to get things through, and offering bribes to other parties, small parties to vote for you and all this sort of thing. And I think by that stage he just had enough, and he thought it was rather a dishonourable kind of politics, really. I think where there may have been a mistake with the Labour Party is that they thought that maybe that Thatcher was going to run into trouble pretty straight away, maybe removed, and they could come back.
Oh, well.
It wouldn't take 18 years to come back. And of course Thatcher did run into trouble, and she could have been removed in 81, but the Tory Wets refused to move against her. Yeah,
I mean that's another counterfactual, isn't it? And then and then the Labour Party split famously, and we had the creation of the SDP. But yeah, you'll never know. I mean, I think it's and very interesting to read in the book Jonathan Aiken's view that he thought that Callaghan was just riding it out to the end as a term, and just accepted the fact that his life would be Prime Minister from 76 to 79. And that was it, and probably expected to lose, and then you
and
have a
Bernard
change.
Donahue says in his memoirs or in his diary that Callaghan, when he was electioneering in 79, said every few years there's a sea change, every 30 years or so. And this is one such sea change, there's nothing we can do about it. Which I think was interpreted by maybe one or two of the contributors in the book as him trying to justify his failure to call an election in the autumn of 78. But I think there was some truth in that. There was a demand for change, particularly, of course, after the
Well, I was young.
discontent.
I'm a little bit older than you, as you know, Kevin, and it was the first general election. I have distant memories of '74 and what have you, but it's the first general election that I was old enough to really to be properly aware of, I think. And no, certainly that was my feeling as a young teenager. I thought, yes, something, and also the first woman Prime Minister as well.
I think there was a feeling from maybe in Callaghan's mind that the trade unions would not go as far as they did in terms of the unburied bodies, the rubbish piling up on the streets, which he thought was disgraceful.
Disgraceful, yeah. And actually, reading if you do a sketch of Callaghan as an individual, of course, nonconformist Victorian, he's been described as, strong support for the armed forces, very traditional views, and against a sort of Jenkins type permissive society. So, it's an absolutely solid figure in the sort of small c conservative Labour tradition, wasn't it?
Very, very small c conservative, yeah, and there's lots of anecdotes in the book about his views about homosexuality, for instance. And he didn't think there were any homosexuals in the Parliamentary Labour Party.
Yes, curious. yes.
And not to mention things in front of his wife because she would be unhappy with them and this sort of thing.
Yeah, very traditionalist view on life. And also another thing I should say, because it's an important fact, that Jim Callaghan came up sort of through the ranks that didn't go to university.
Yeah.
And I think he'd probably be the last Prime Minister not to go to
Yeah.
university, but an extremely able man. And the politician that I think, I mean, it'd be interesting to get your view on this, the politician in the United States that I would compare him to is Lyndon Johnson, who also had, the two things that are really interesting about Callaghan and Johnson are their party management and their consummate political skill in managing people.
Yeah.
Massively good at that. But both, the presidency and Callaghan's prime ministership were ruined largely by forces beyond their control. Do you think it's a good comparison, those two?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. And as you say, he was, because of the poverty, childhood poverty that he had, he wasn't able to go to university and instead rose up through the trade union ranks. And again, I think it goes back to the Peter Shore thing as well. That Peter Shore worked as a special advisor, as we would now call it. They both had rich lives outside of politics.
Yes.
They both had backgrounds. They both had cultural reference points.
Yeah.
And again, that's something which is lacking, I think, in contemporary politicians.
Well, yeah, the sort of graduate takeover of politics and the think tank conveyor belt. I totally agree. I mean, Callaghan had a war record, in that he was in the Royal Navy and he had that hinterland.
Yeah. And Shore in the RAF.
Yes, and that generation, Healy, they were actually a completely different set of personalities to modern day, certainly to the modern day Labour Party. And I, as I say, I hold both of these men in very high esteem. And so can I finally just thank you for getting these books together. They're a wonderful read. And I would urge anyone to go out and avail themselves of a copy.
Okay, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you, Kevin. Cheers.